The following program is made possible by the Zicklin School of Business at Baruch College, CUNY.
We often hear complaints of huge multinationals taking advantage of their size and clout overseas to exploit workers and destroy local environments. But what if a company wanted to do right by its local workforce and become a positive force in a foreign country? How would that work? Could it work? I'm Sarah Bartlett, and this is our topic today on USA Inc. Joining us today is David Lowry, who has had one of the business world's more unusual job titles, Human Rights Compliance Officer at Freeport McMoRan, which operates the world's largest copper and gold mine in a remote area of Indonesia. David, thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
Can you tell us why Freeport McMoRan thought they needed a Human Rights Compliance Officer?
We thought it was necessary because of the unique area in which we have the opportunity to work. We're on the edges of where government functions, on the western side of the island of New Guinea, which is part of Indonesia. And it's one of the most remote and least developed parts of the world. And for that reason, there's not much effective government in the area. What we do have, however, is police, and we do have army in the area. And we are in a region where there is a low-level separatist movement, and there are often clashes. When those clashes come close to our operation, human rights issues come to the fore. When the human rights issues come to the fore, it's a very complex set of interactions between local community, the business itself, and the government through the army and the police. My job as Human Rights Compliance Officer, as well as a Vice President of Social Development and Community Relations, was to make sure that we weren't shortchanging the complex issues of human dignity and human rights. And therefore, I inherited that very unique title.
It's sort of an unusual position for an American mining corporation to be in. Can you talk about the kinds of things that you tried to do to change the way the world worked there for your employees?
Certainly, and it wasn't just for employees. The big issue were the people who had come to live around the mine. When we started, there were 1,000 indigenous people living in a 320 square mile area. Today, there are over 120,000 people, many of them indigenous Papuans, but almost an equal number from other parts of Indonesia. So there's a huge demographic change. And therefore there are very different dynamics. There's a lot of economic growth, which is both positive and can be negative at the same time, creating issues that can bring unrest and sometimes violence. So what we try to do is to make sure that we, in a very sensitive way, without betraying any confidences, gather the information about potential human rights violations or other problems. Not everything we hear about is a human rights violation, but it's almost an ombudsman's position to take in information, evaluate what the information means, and then put that information in the hands of the right person to try to solve it. Sometimes that's within the company. Sometimes it's within the government. Sometimes it's specifically with the police and with the army. Sometimes we use churches. It's one of those things that one could not define easily what it is. It's more a sensitivity than it is a procedure.
Now, in getting more immersed in the way that the community functions, have you had to help them with medical care and education? I mean, how broadly have you operated there?
Well, very broadly. One of the issues that extractive industries face throughout the world is we pay, whatever form it may be in, taxes, royalties, revenue sharing agreements. we often provide for nations and governments very large amounts of money. One of the issues, however, is how much of that money comes back and in what form to the local area from which the resource is being extracted. We knew there were formulas within Indonesia for revenues to return to the local area, but it was very hard for us to see what was coming back and to be able to know whether a right amount was coming back and to the right people. In 1996, we decided to set up a fund. We called it various things, the Freeport Fund for Indonesia, Irian Jaya Development, and now it's called the Freeport Partnership Fund, which puts 1% of our net revenue, and that's about $20 million a year, into the local community. We have, over the years, permitted increasingly the local community to administer those funds themselves by setting up boards of eventual oversight and practical development.
How is the money being used? What is it being spent on? It's a lot of money.
Medical care is about 40%. It's an area where there's a lot of malaria, there's a lot of tuberculosis. Generally, medical care has not been available. 2 hospitals have been built. They are both excellent medical facilities. The local board runs those hospitals with help from outside medical care providers. About 30% is used on education because there's very little education in the area. The remainder is used for small business development and human resources development, and then some infrastructure for the community. So it's a huge amount of money. The commitment goes on for many years, and it will probably come close by the end of the life of the mine being a $1 billion commitment to the development of the local community. There are very good things in that, obviously. There also are great difficulties that creates because there's a honeypot effect. Just with medical care, every Papuan in the local area around Freeport's operation gets about $120 per year in medical care provided free. In the rest of Irian Jaya, or what's now called West Papua, it's a little over $1 a person per year. So if you're ill, you might as well leave where you are and come to this other area. So we need to look for ways in which those benefits can be more fairly distributed to the benefit of the greater number of people. Not everyone locally wants it distributed fairly, and because the haves want to have more and the have-nots want to have, and that can cause conflict.
Now, most companies would want to keep that $20 million a year for themselves, or ultimately $1 billion. How hard was it for Freeport McMoRan to decide to do this? Presumably their competition isn't being quite as magnanimous. Was this a major...
It was a major business decision. It wasn't just a philanthropic decision, although I hope there was some philanthropy in it. It was a business decision because having people around you who are unhappy with your presence, who don't feel that they are sharing in the positive economic growth and perceiving that this is their local area and not yours, creates conflict. And shutting down a mine for a day or two can cost you $6–7 million. So you both, want to do what's right, but also you want to make the business decision. And we think it was a very helpful business decision. You hear from other places where operations are closed for a week, for a month, and we could lose much more money very quickly. But I think more than that, there was a sense from the chairman on down that we wanted to do what was right, and this was a way to do what was right.
Is that where this came from, the chairman's position?
Yes, very much so. I mean, he was the ultimate creator of a vision, and then it was our job to help that vision be established.
Have you heard anything from shareholders about how they feel about this? Has it benefited the company in terms of investor perception?
We have heard nothing negative, and we take that as a positive. When your investors are not saying that we don't want you to share that money, and we want to have it ourselves, we think that's a positive thing. In terms of people saying, boy, I just want to go and buy Freeport McMoRan stock because you're giving money to local communities, we haven't heard that either.
Have other companies approached you about your program? I mean, it seems that it's very unique.
Well, it's not totally unique. I think increasingly in the extractive sectors, people are recognizing that they must do this, that we can't count on host governments to provide those benefits. There are increasing demands that profits be shared equitably with stakeholders, not just with shareholders, and certainly not just with employees. So I think we're seeing a lot of people doing the same thing. We like to feel we're somewhat ahead of the curve on it, but we don't think we're out there alone.
How was the figure 1% arrived at? I mean, why not 2% or 5%?
Right. Well, there were two considerations. Number one, we actually looked at what we were doing for the local community. And anyway, we held that number up against our revenue, and it came out pretty close to 1%. So we said 1% it will be. Some people have said, well, 1% isn't that much. Well, it's 1% of revenue. We chose revenue rather than profits because profits can go all over the place. And one year you could be $40 million going to the local community, and the next year it would be zero. We didn't want that. We wanted to create a steady flow, and we knew that even with commodity prices moving up and down, our revenues would stay fairly even from year to year, and thought that was the best way to run it.
Is it regarded locally as a huge amount of money, or do they feel that you should be giving even more?
I think it's regarded by many as a huge amount of money. Some would even say it's too much money to be taken into the area and used effectively. And therefore we're working and have already created a mechanism where some of that money will be put in trust for future generations. Others would say there's never going to be enough money that they would want put into the area. So I don't think there's any consensus on that.
There's no right number.
There is no right number.
We'll be right back.
The Zicklin School of Business at Baruch College of the City University of New York is the largest and most diverse accredited business school in the United States, offering high-quality, full-time, and part-time degree programs at the undergraduate, master's, and PhD levels. For information about the Zicklin School of Business, please visit our website, zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu. That's zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu.
Welcome back. We're talking with David Lowry, former Human Rights Compliance Officer at Freeport McMoRan. David, can you tell us a little bit about the working conditions of a typical employee at the mine? What kind of wages do they get? Where do they live? What's the housing like?
Very good question. In this age where there is so much concern about working conditions overseas, and especially with regard to manufacturing in multinational corporations, the extractive industry actually is on a very different page. Low wages don't gain much for us. High productivity gains a lot. Good resources gain a lot for us, but not low wages. And because our work is difficult, it's dangerous. Our mine is at 13,000 feet above sea level. Parts of it were 14,000. We've taken about 1,000 feet off the top of a mountain. There's no place to make either a person's work more difficult or to give them less than their due in salaries. So our salaries are very high.
Can you give me an example? What is high?
Yeah, it ranges obviously all over the place, but we're talking about in a country where the per capita income is around down to around $500 a year. We're talking about people who are starting at $4,000 a year, and we will have Papuans and other Indonesians who are not Papuan in technical positions who are making $20,000 a year. We also provide housing for all employees. Many people are there with their families, not all of them. It's a very remote area. Many people choose not to have their families there. So working conditions that's not an issue that we have to face.
You don't get a lot of complaints from workers,
we
and that's
don't,
not
we
part
do not,
of your...
We do not get complaints from workers. We get, especially with Papuans, we've made a very special commitment to make sure that Papuans have employment opportunities and not just Indonesians from other parts of Indonesia, because Papuans have been disadvantaged, and the mine is in Papua. And we made a commitment to 40% of our workforce will be Papuan by the year 2006, which is a major change and a huge commitment. But we feel it's the right commitment and it's the proper thing to do, even though it means getting very much into the education and the remedial training business.
It sounds like the company has really taken on challenges that go way beyond what a typical American corporation thinks about. You're helping to house, you're helping to educate, you're helping to take care of them medically. Do you feel that you're equipped to do this, and how do you get the local people to help you do this?
Yeah. Well, it's, I mean, the local people love to help do it. Mm-hmm. The problem is that this is an area where there is so little experience. 50 years ago, the most local people had never met an outsider. So they are going from, some people say, Stone Age, I'm not sure that that's fair, to the 21st century in a generation and a half. And that's a huge challenge for them. And it's a challenge for us, but it's a greater challenge for them than it is for us. And that's important to remember. And I think what, you know, it's not that we're doing all these things just beyond any need to do. I think when you're in the extractive industries, when you're at the edges of development, it is a responsibility to do these things. Do we drop the ball doing it? Yes. Have we made some horrendous mistakes trying to do it? Yes. Do we have people who aren't on board with doing it? Absolutely. But you take a step forward whenever you can take the step forward and do the best you can. And we're not alone in doing this. This is something others are doing as well.
Are there some managers who wish that you didn't have this commitment because it complicates their life?
Undoubtedly so.
Yeah.
But we try to make sure that you get rewarded for being on board. And you know, there was a time when how many widgets you made and how much rock you got in the box was the only way you got rewarded. Today we're trying to find a better balance on rewards and dealing with the local community, dealing with the environment, making sure that that people are treated right in the workplace is now a major part of key performance indicators, which help determine what your bonus will be and what salary increases you will get.
Well, that leads to my next question. How do you know how well you're doing? You've decided, I believe, to undertake an independent audit. What's that all about? Tell us about that.
Well, what we want to do is know whether we are performing in the areas that we have identified as well as we should. And one of the problems, whether it be in raising children or being married or running almost any activity, it's sometimes when you're in the midst of the activity, it's hard to know what you're really doing because you're so involved in the activity. So we looked around, we talked with a variety of people, and we made a decision 2.5 years ago to go down the road with a professor from this university, Professor Prakash Sethi, who was doing monitoring for Mattel. And Mattel is a totally different business than a mining business. But we thought the model that he and Mattel had created for an organization now called the International Center for Corporate Accountability was a model that worked. And in that, we set our policies. We developed, along with Professor Sethi, what we call guiding principles based on that policy. And now we're going to start auditing whether we are actually doing the things that we say we're doing. Aspirational policy statements are terrific, but making sure that your aspirations are actually turned into some real actions and real programs, and then that those programs are doing what you say they're doing, I think is a key issue going forward, whether you're in toy manufacture or clothes manufacture or pharmaceuticals, and certainly in the extractives. The more complex the situation, the harder it is to do an audit, but the more important it is that you do an audit. And we're about 2 years into that process. We will, one hopes, do our first audit within the next 6 months. It will be publicly available. We can't change the audit results. We can comment on them. They'll be on our website. They'll be on the International Center for Corporate Accountability website. But mostly we will use it internally. Are we doing what we say we're doing? Are we succeeding in our commitments?
How hard a sell was that internally to get people to agree to do this?
In theory, it wasn't hard. When you get to the
practice?
nitty-gritty in practice, it's harder because everybody says, well, I want to do that, until you say, well, we're going to scrutinize every employment record of a Papuan. And then they say, well, we're not sure all our records are up to snuff, or we're not sure that we really have kept records on that. And the audit team has had to go back and say, well, I don't care whether you had records, you will have records going forward. And this is what we need from the record, is a Papuan moving through the employment process as anybody else would. Are these Papuans actually an integral part of the workforce, or do you just have an extra 2,000 janitors? And you know, all of a sudden, the commitment gets a lot dicier than it appeared to be when you said, you know, it's going to be all apple pie.
Do you have any sense yet of how you're doing against your own set of internal guidelines?
I think we're doing fairly well, but fairly is maybe an important word there. We keep finding things where we say, well, no, that's not doing as well as we need to do.
Can you give us an example?
Yes, I mean, just something as simple as making this available, money available to the community, and we're the donor, and you have this idea, well, we give the money away, and what the people down the line in the local community would do with these funds doesn't matter. The audit says it does matter. If you're a donor, you must take responsibility, and if the local committee is not properly using the money, you as the donor have to step in. Well, that came as a little shock to us. Another example would be with contractors, where we use contract labor and outsource some of our activities, and making sure that our contractors are actually living up to the contracts plus our commitments. And we really didn't ask those questions as seriously as we now have to ask them.
Are people coming forward in a sort of whistleblower sense to tell you when they see problems? I mean, can that actually happen in an area that you've described as being so remote, where there's rebels wandering around with machine guns? I mean, how realistic is it to think that people will come forward?
We have to create an atmosphere in which my successor as Human Rights Compliance Officer and the others on the staff create a sense of credibility and trust. The answer is, I'd been there for 14 years. I knew many local people, most employees. I had done other jobs. I'd been Vice President of Human Resources for a number of years. So I knew people. And it's very much a personal trust that's created. You can't just drop down an ombudsman or a human rights officer from the sky and have it work. You build trust over a period of time. And many societies struggle with trust and trust of outsiders. And that's what we're working on very heartily in the transition period as I move out and others move in, is continuing that trust. And that's what it's all based on.
How important is an initiative like this for the image of the American corporation overseas? We see so much concern right now that we're often hated for our values. Is this kind of a way to get that to change?
I hope so. The interesting thing for me is that those people who buy stocks, and a lot of them are not individual investors, are so interested in in performance financially, that although they may give lip service to many of these ethical and social issues, at the end of the day, that's not what's so terribly important to them. I think the greater importance, though, is when you are able to, as an American corporation or any multinational corporation, to create an atmosphere in which governments and others, local communities, trust you, you can then expand your operation. You can move to another place, which has long-term financial implications, much more than any immediate issue in terms of share price and the like. But the most important thing to remember is doing the right thing is doing the right thing. And that's worth something at the end of the day.
David, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll be right back.
Some people think of New York as the world's second home. The City University of New York, with students coming from 90 countries and speaking more than 155 languages, is the world's first university. Find us on the web at cuny.edu or call us at 1-800-CUNY-YES.
The Bush administration is undertaking a massive experiment in Iraq to create a model of democratic capitalism that it hopes will capture the hearts and minds of the entire region. Yet in that and many other developing nations... Okay. See, you've caught my bug.
In 5, 4, 3.
The Bush administration is undertaking a massive experiment in Iraq to create a model of democratic capitalism that it hopes will capture the hearts and minds of the entire region. Yet in that and many other developing nations of the world, the first-hand experience of American capitalism is not so reassuring. Young people, frequently teenagers, work at least 10-hour days, often 7 days a week, in squalid or even dangerous conditions for next to nothing in wages. It's hard to persuade others of the correctness of our ways when our corporate role models are frequently breeding hatred and discontent. Some companies have recognized that it's in their interest to improve the conditions of the local communities in which they operate. However, only a handful have agreed to let independent groups monitor their programs and make sure they're truly effective and not just window dressing. Consumers and shareholders could do more to pressure American companies to behave as good citizens overseas. It's in all of our interests. For USA Inc., I'm Sarah Bartlett.